It all began on a day that looked like every other day in her quiet town. A morning where the sun rose gently, families prepared for work and school, and life moved with a familiar rhythm. No one could have imagined that within a few short hours, everything would shift into a nightmare that would grip the nation. She stepped out for what should have been a simple routine, something she had done countless times before, but this time she didn't return. And that small break in the rhythm of her life was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. When her family couldn't reach her, panic began to rise, not instantly, but slowly, like an unsettling fog creeping in. You always try to tell yourself there's a logical explanation, that everything is fine, that she'll walk through the door the same way she always had. But minutes turned to hours, and the silence grew heavier, more alarming, more suffocating. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Friends hadn't seen her. No one had any idea where she could have gone. It wasn't like her to disappear, and they knew it. Before long, the fear that something unthinkable had happened began to take root. The family reported her missing, and those first moments with the authorities were filled with uncertainty. Was this a misunderstanding? Had she gone somewhere without telling anyone? Or was there something darker, something more sinister at play? Investigators began retracing her last known steps, interviewing people, checking surveillance footage, anything that could offer a clue. But the strangest thing was how quickly the trail went cold. No suspicious activity, no obvious motive, no sign of a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. And that, more than anything, terrified everyone who knew her. Within hours, the news spread across the community, and neighbors began to knock on the door, offering help, offering prayers, offering the kind of support that comes when you realize someone's life may be hanging in the balance. Flyers were printed, social media posts were shared, volunteers flooded the streets, searching fields, back roads, and abandoned areas, hoping to spot something, anything that could bring answers. And yet, for all the searching, for all the desperate hope, nothing surfaced. The longer she remained missing, the heavier the dread grew. Every night, her parents kept the front porch light on, refusing to let the darkness win, refusing to accept the idea that she might never come home. But deep down, even though no one wanted to say it out loud, there was a growing sense that something evil had taken hold. Something cruel, something that would stretch beyond the imagination of anyone involved. And in those early hours and days before the truth came crashing into the world, the only thing people could cling to was the possibility, thin as it felt, that she was still alive somewhere, waiting, fighting, praying for a chance to be found. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of uncertainty wrapped itself around the entire community. What began as a hopeful, determined search slowly shifted into something far more desperate. At first, everyone believed she would be found quickly, that she'd walk out from somewhere with a story of being lost, of something unexpected but harmless. But when each day ended with no answers, the silence became deafening. Investigators worked tirelessly, combing through every possible lead with increasing urgency. They interviewed friends, colleagues, neighbors, anyone who had interacted with her. They checked security cameras from stores, gas stations, and homes, hoping for a glimpse, even a shadow, but nothing revealed itself. That absence of evidence was chilling because it meant someone had planned this well. Someone had taken her in a way that left no trace. And that realization unsettled the entire town. The broader community continued to show up in overwhelming numbers. Cars lined the roads as volunteers searched through forests, rivers, and outskirts of the city. People who had never met her felt compelled to help, driven by compassion and by a growing fear that this could have happened to anyone. Candlelight vigils were held, prayers whispered, posters taped to every corner and shop window. Her face became a symbol of urgency, a reminder of how quickly life can change. But with each passing day, fewer clues emerged. Every lead that seemed promising ended up being a dead end. Every tip that sparked hope eventually dissolved into nothing. And slowly, painfully, the search that once buzzed with energy began losing momentum. Investigators faced mounting pressure. News outlets began covering the case as questions grew louder. How can someone disappear under everyone's watch? How can a community so alert still find nothing? Experts speculated, families agonized, and fear began settling into people's daily routines. Parents became more protective, neighbors more suspicious, and the town itself felt different, like something dark had settled over it. And yet, even with the growing tension, people were determined not to give up. But what made it even more heartbreaking was the slow fade of hope as the case seemed to slip into the background. Other news stories emerged, other events took over headlines, and her name wasn't mentioned as often as before. The once daily updates on the investigation became weekly, then less frequent, until many began wondering if the truth would ever come out. Still, her family refused to accept silence as an answer. They kept pushing, kept begging for information, kept calling for new searches, even when others began losing strength. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that while they waited and watched, she was living a nightmare no one could imagine. While the world was trying to find her, she was trapped in the shadows, fighting to stay alive with no idea if help would ever come. The case may have gone cold, but her story was only growing darker. Inside the walls of the place she was held, time didn't feel real anymore. It didn't move in minutes or hours. It stretched, warped, twisted into something unbearable. The first thing she felt was confusion, a disoriented panic as she tried to understand where she was and how she'd gotten there. But confusion quickly turned into fear once she realized she was trapped, completely cut off from the world she once knew. The room was small, cold, isolated from any sign of life. There were no windows, no clocks, nothing to mark the passing of days. Just the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in the silence. Each day became a battle, not just for survival, but for sanity. She learned the patterns of the one holding her captive, the footsteps, the breathing, the shifting moods that determined whether the day would bring cruelty or neglect. She never knew when the door would open or what would come through it, and that uncertainty was its own form of torture. The threat wasn't always physical. Sometimes the worst pain was psychological, being spoken to like she was worthless, being isolated so completely that she began questioning her own identity, her memories, even her hope. There were nights she cried until her body couldn't produce any more tears, nights when she forced herself to stay awake out of fear of what might happen if she drifted off. And yet, even in that darkness, something in her refused to break. A small, quiet voice inside her whispered that she had to hold on, that she had to keep fighting because someone out there was searching for her. Even if she couldn't see it, even if she couldn't feel it, she clung to the belief that she mattered to someone, that she wasn't forgotten. But the reality was brutal. Her captor controlled everything. Her movement, her food, her sleep, her light, her silence. The world outside kept spinning, but for her, life had paused in the worst possible way. She endured moments where she felt like she was floating outside of herself just to survive. Moments where the fear became so overwhelming that her mind numbed itself just to keep going. She counted cracks on the wall, traced patterns on the floor, whispered prayers into the darkness, anything to keep her mind anchored. And yet, even through the torment, she learned to adapt. She studied her surroundings, memorized sounds, searched for weaknesses in her confinement. Her strength didn't always look like courage. Sometimes it looked like breathing through another panic attack, or forcing herself to eat, or simply refusing to give up when giving up would have been the easier option. What she endured in those 9 months was something no one could ever fully understand unless they had lived it themselves, but she survived each day with a quiet defiance that her captor didn't even notice. She held on when everything around her seemed designed to crush her spirit. Somewhere deep within that endless stretch of fear and isolation, there came a moment that didn't feel like the others. It wasn't dramatic at first, not some loud crash or sudden confrontation, but something subtle, almost fragile, like a crack forming in a thick wall. She noticed it one day when her captor made a small mistake, something so minor that most people wouldn't have thought twice about it, but to someone who had spent months studying every sound, every movement, every breath inside that place, it was a shift she felt immediately. Maybe it was the way the door didn't latch fully. Maybe it was a set of keys left a little too close. Or maybe it was simply the change in his routine, something unpredictable in a world that had been painfully predictable for too long. Whatever it was, it ignited something in her, something she hadn't felt in months. Hope didn't rush in all at once. It crept in quietly, carefully, as if afraid to disturb the darkness. She didn't let herself get excited because she knew hope could be painful, but she also knew she couldn't ignore what she had seen. She spent days observing, waiting, trying to understand whether that moment was truly an opportunity or just a fleeting coincidence. Fear lingered in every thought. Fear that if she acted too soon, he would tighten his control, make escape impossible. Fear that she might misjudge something and pay the price. But alongside that fear was something stronger, a voice within her reminding her she hadn't survived all these months for nothing. She began to prepare herself mentally. She played out scenarios in her head, imagining her movements, timing her breaths, rehearsing every detail of what she might have to do. She knew she wasn't physically strong, not after so much deprivation, but she also knew that survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about awareness, timing, and courage disguised as desperation. And she was desperate enough to risk everything. There were moments when doubt almost crushed her. She questioned whether she truly had a chance, or whether the hope she felt was just her mind trying to cope with the misery. But every time she felt herself slipping back into despair, something pulled her forward. The memory of her family, the sound of her name being called in her dreams, the belief that there had to be more to her story than pain, that her life wasn't meant to end in that dark, forgotten place. Then came the night when everything aligned. The same mistake repeated once more, the same pattern broke in the same quiet way. But this time, she was ready. Her heart pounded so fiercely she worried he might hear it through the walls. Her hands trembled, not from weakness but from the gravity of what she was about to attempt. She wasn't sure if this was her only chance or simply the first of many small opportunities. But she knew one thing for certain. If she didn't act that night, she might never act at all. The moment she decided to act was the moment her entire body shifted from survival to escape. Fear was still there. It pulsed through her veins, made her breath shaky, made her muscles tense, but something inside her had grown louder than fear. That quiet inner voice that had been whispering for months suddenly rose with clarity. This was her chance. This was the moment she had been waiting for through every sleepless night, every whispered prayer, every silent plea for the nightmare to end. She knew she wasn't just running for freedom, she was running for her life. The door that had always seemed impenetrable now sat slightly open, almost mocking her with how simple it looked. She watched it for several long seconds, listening for footsteps, for breathing, for any sign that her captor was near. When she heard nothing but the low hum of the building, she forced herself to move. Her legs felt heavy, weak from months of confinement, but adrenaline surged through her like a second heartbeat, pushing her forward. She eased toward the door, every movement careful, slow, controlled. The slightest sound could end everything. She paused again, pressing her ear to the crack, hearing only silence on the other side. That silence felt like an invitation. When she finally slipped through the doorway and into the hall, her entire world shifted. It was the first time in months she had been beyond that single room. The air felt different, cooler, as if reminding her that a world still existed beyond the walls of her captivity. She moved quickly but quietly, scanning the hallway, searching for an exit or any sign of danger. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. Every corner she turned, every darkened doorway she passed, she expected to see him. She expected a hand to grab her, a voice to shout, a lock to slam shut. But the building remained eerily still, as if holding its breath with her. When she found a back door, she hesitated. She wasn't sure what waited outside. She didn't know if the area was monitored, if someone else was watching, or if she would be stepping into another trap. But staying wasn't an option, not anymore. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open, and for the first time in 9 months, she saw the night sky. The wind hit her face like a shock, almost overwhelming after being starved of fresh air for so long. She didn't savor the moment, she ran. She didn't look back, didn't slow down, didn't give herself time to think. She ran through the darkness, through the pain shooting up her legs, through the panic clawing at her chest. She didn't know how far she traveled before she finally saw headlights approaching on the road. She stumbled toward them, waving her arms, crying out for help with a voice she barely recognized as her own. When the car slowed and the driver stepped out, everything inside her collapsed. She had made it. She had escaped. She was alive. When the world finally learned she had been found alive, everything stopped. The story that had once faded into cold case silence surged back into the public eye with a force no one expected. News stations scrambled to cover every detail. People who had once prayed for her return broke down in tears of relief. Entire communities that had lived with the fear of the unknown finally had an answer that carried both joy and heartbreak. Because even though she had survived, the truth of what she endured was almost too heavy for anyone to comprehend. She had walked out of a nightmare that many feared would end in tragedy, but survival didn't erase the pain. It only marked the beginning of a new battle. The reunion with her family was emotional beyond words. Those who had spent months searching for her, hoping for her, refusing to let her memory fade, held her like she might disappear again if they let go. And yet, behind the relief in their eyes was a deep, aching sadness for what she had lived through. They could see it in her, the exhaustion, the fear, the trauma that lingered in her expression even as she tried to smile. Her freedom was beautiful, but it came with scars no one could see at first glance. Authorities moved swiftly, and the investigation reignited with a fire it hadn't seen in months. The man who had stolen her life for 9 months was captured, and the courtroom became a place where truth finally had a voice. She didn't sit there as a victim. She sat there as someone who had survived the very worst and was now demanding justice, not just for herself but for anyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or forgotten. And as the details of her captivity came to light, the nation was shaken. People questioned how something so horrific could go unnoticed for so long. They questioned the systems that failed her, the warning signs that might have been missed, and the fragile nature of safety itself. But out of that shock came change. New laws were proposed, new safety measures put into place, new awareness campaigns sparked across the country. Her story wasn't just another crime to be filed away. It became a catalyst for national conversation, a reminder that vigilance, community, and compassion matter more than ever. She became a symbol of strength, inspiring others who had faced trauma to speak, to heal, to reclaim their lives. And while her recovery was not easy, she faced it the same way she had faced each day in captivity, with quiet resilience. There were moments she broke down, moments she questioned why she had survived, moments where the memories felt too heavy to carry, but there were also moments of light, small, fragile steps toward healing. She began therapy, surrounded herself with support, and slowly rebuilt the life she had been robbed of. She found moments of laughter again, moments of peace, moments where she rediscovered parts of herself she thought were lost forever. Her story didn't end when she escaped. It continued through every breath she took after, every boundary she set, every truth she spoke. And the nation, once shaken by her disappearance, now stood in awe of her return, because in surviving the darkness she became a reminder that even in the most hopeless circumstances, the human spirit can still rise.